Hello and welcome to another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards have both been playing extremely well lately for the Wolves. Even during this bad losing streak that the Wolves just snapped with the win against Denver the other night, what's gone into their play? What is significantly better for both McDaniels and Anton? Why it's so important that they're both playing so well at this point in the season? Plus a preview of Wolves Blazers on Wednesday night. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. And happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves take on the Blazers this evening. It's the first time we've seen them in, I guess, a couple of weeks. Portland, of course, won twice consecutive games in Portland a couple of weeks ago. So we'll talk about this matchup, the rematch. The Wolves get the chance to, avenge those consecutive losses from a couple of weeks ago. So we'll break down that matchup later. But I want to talk Jaden McDaniels and Ant here for the first part of the podcast. First, though, off the top, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. This show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota on both the Roku and Amazon Fire TV app. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and then also my account, which is at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, let's talk Jaden McDaniels first. So the Timberwolves obviously just lost 6 in a row. They lost rock bottom. You know, I'm going to keep saying this to hopefully speak this into existence, that this was rock bottom on last Saturday. This loss to the Pistons, the league's the team with the worst record in the league. By the way, a Pistons team that was just blown up by Portland on Monday of this week, just 2 days after the Pistons beat the Timberwolves. But during this stretch of games, both Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards have played extremely well. Generally speaking, obviously there's been blips, but we'll call it the last 10 games or so. And I want to dive into some numbers here. Talk about Jaden McDaniels as a whole, because it was only a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I think it was right after the 2 games in Portland when I talked about on this show, I did a extended segment about how I was most concerned about Ant of any Timberwolves player this season. Not Towns, not Rudy Gobert, nobody else. It was Ant that I was not D'Angelo Russell. It was Ant that I was most worried about. Since that show, Ant has kind of flipped things. He's played extremely well, almost exactly since I did that show a few weeks ago. And we'll get into Ant more here in a minute. But over that period of time, Jaden McDaniels has also improved. And again, what I started to say a minute ago is, we could look at Ant's season last year and his body of work this season, not just the last 10 games, and argue that, hey, Ant was actually better as a whole last year than he has been to this point this season. I do think over the last 10 games, he's playing more in line with what we saw towards the end of last season. But with McDaniels, I don't think there's any question that he's having the best season of his career. And, he, as a rookie, he was, I think, a surprise for how good he was, especially defensively. Last year, we saw some growth, but maybe not as much as I think many fans and the team expected or hoped for. And this year, we're finally starting to see that. Early on in the season, it was some positive blips on the radar, right? It was the opener against the Thunder, but he had 19-6. Got to the line 10 times, and then, had a couple of quiet games. And then he had a 20-point game and a double-digit win over San Antonio, and everybody's like, okay, this is what we waited for. And then 5 of the next 6 games, Jaden scores in single digits. This is going back now to late October, early November. And then he had a stretch where he played much better. And then I think it was an illness. He missed 3 games. And then more recently, he's come back and played really well, just kind of an all-around performance that's been better. And I want to get into those numbers here in a second. But first, I want to talk about Jaden's, overall game this year. So for the season, McDaniels is up in a couple of key areas. The first thing for me is this isn't a stat, but the eye test would tell you he's just being more aggressive in general. He's a more aggressive cutter, which is really something that shouldn't be that difficult to do, but guys get better at it with more reps, right? It's just like with anything else. The more opportunities you have to cut, the more times you do it, the more comfortable you are with it, the more defensive coverages you see at the NBA level, the the better you are at understanding when and where and how to cut, right? McDaniels has improved in that greatly. He's also become a quicker decision maker. One of my gripes with him the last couple of seasons was he would get a pass. If it wasn't an immediately open 3-point attempt, it was a pump fake, sometimes a half-hearted one, and then a dribble into a contested long two. We saw that a ton as a rookie. That was kind of like once or twice a game. McDaniels would take a tough contested long two instead of a semi-open 3-pointer, right? And he also didn't shoot the ball well from three, at least last season. He was pretty good as a rookie, around league average. But then last year we saw a little bit of growth where he'd actually put it on the deck and get to the rim more often than not. And now this year, that confidence appears to have really spiked, and he's getting into the paint more frequently. He's shooting the ball at the rim more often, and he's making shots at the rim more often. In fact, as a rookie, only 69% of his shot attempts came within 3 feet of the rim. Last year, it was just under 73%. Now this year, it's over 76% of his shot attempts are coming within 3 feet of the rim. I'm sorry, I just read percentage instead of percentage of attempts. Those are improving too, right? That was going to be my next point. The actual percentage of his field goal attempts is increasing as well, from 23% of his shots within 3 feet as a rookie to 28% last year to 35% of his field goal attempts, according to Basketball Reference, are within 3 feet of the basket. So more than 1 in 3 of McDaniels' shot attempts are at the rim. For the first 2 seasons of his career is about 1 in 4. And now we're at more than 1 in 3. So that's a huge improvement. The field goal percentage, as I mentioned a minute ago, is up from 69% as a rookie, 72.5% last season to 76% at the rim this year. And the free throw rate has also improved. It's up to 0.179. Over the first 2 years of his career, he had a free throw rate of 0.126, which is significant. I mean, if you want to talk about it, this is maybe a little easier to conceptualize, but if you want to talk about free throw attempts per game, he's not shooting a ton, but 1.5 free throw attempts per game is 50% more than 1 per game, right? Last year, he averaged 1 free throw attempt per game. This year, he's 1.5. So he's improved his free throw attempts per game by 50%. And the free throw rate then, of course, has gone up as well. So those are all positive developments. It means he's getting to the rim more often. A lot of it's on straight line drives where he's actually being aggressive. He's, again, being more decisive. He's getting the pass and he's cutting instead of getting the pass, hesitating, half-hearted pump fake, dribble into a tough shot, right? And some of it's because of the cutting. It's just the aggressiveness. The level of aggressiveness for Jaden McDaniels is up this year offensively, and that's huge. And then playing off of that, we've seen the assist rate increase. Yes, modestly, by a 1.8. So he's up to just a tick under 8% this year. Not great, but he also isn't initiating offense. That means things are generally slowing down. He's making smarter decisions. The turnover rate's up too. But in this case, I don't think that's a bad thing. Well, sure, you'd want a lower turnover rate, but I think it's an indicator that he's taking a few more chances. He's got the ball in his hands more often. He's doing a few more things. And I think that that's important. We've also seen on the defensive end, the block rates back up to where it was as a rookie. The steal rates at the highest in his career. I think the overall activity on that end of the floor is better too. And while the eye test would have said, hey, he's a pretty good defender over the first 2 years, he is a genuinely A+ defender now this season. All the metrics would tell you that, all your box score stats. ESPN's Real Plus Minus has him in the top 15 small forwards in terms, or power forwards in terms of defensive Real Plus Minus, which again, it's not the end all be all, but you pick any defensive metric and he's a plus defender, which matches the eye test that everybody, scouts have loved and NBA teams have apparently sought after on the trade market. The Wolves love about him. He is a versatile defender. He's backed that up this year in a lot of different ways. So we've seen the biggest thing to me, the decisiveness, the aggressiveness on offense, converting that into free throw attempts, made shots at the rims, both, attempts and made shots. The assist rate's up, the turnover rate's up, and then defensively, the steal and block rates are up. And specifically over the last 10 games or so, we've really seen that improvement out of Jaden McDaniels. The game log would tell that story. He had a couple, this is, coming on the heels of a really good game against who they beat on Monday, Denver on Monday. That was a really impressive performance. That, of course, is on the heels of a weak performance against Detroit, the timeout before that, and against the Bucks before that. But overall, if you take the body of work over the last 10 games, and we're going to do the same thing for Ant here in a moment, Jaden McDaniels is averaging almost 14 points per game on 55% shooting, 43% from three-point range over the last 10 on 3 attempts per game. And I generally don't like when people TV broadcasts do this all the time. Just take over the last 5 games or the last 10 games or the last 3 games. Okay, fine. You can pick arbitrary dates all you want. But this, 10 games is a decent enough sample that we've seen that improvement. There was that dip a couple of games ago, but then, the roller coaster comes back up for this game against Denver on Monday. And if you splice up McDaniel's season into 10-game blocks, this is the best 10-game block he's had so far. And I think that there's a case to be made that we're seeing real improvement. Again, the eye test with the decisiveness, all the things we've already talked about are very apparent for Jaden. Again, 55% for the field over the last 10, 43% from three. And he's gotten to line just a hair under twice per game, which is up from his season average of 1.5 times per game. So all of those things are trending in the right direction for McDaniels. Of course, over those 10 games, the Wolves had a 6-game losing streak right in the middle, but they've won the other 4. So they're 4-6 over the last 10. While Jaden and Ant have both shown these different levels of improvement. I want to get into Edwards here in a minute. Jaden, to me, is the most impressive because you could argue this is the best stretch he's had of his entire career because, game 1 through 38 right now, this is the best season he's had, compared to his first 2 seasons in the league. I think this last stretch of 10 games is probably his best overall stretch of 10 games as well. Oh, and I want to make one more point about Jaden. We'll do that here in a minute before we get to Ant. So we'll do all that here next. And then lastly, we'll get to this matchup against the Blazers on Wednesday. So we'll do all that here still on the show here today. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season, which is wrapping up with the championship game next week, to NBA basketball, as well as all college sports, obviously college basketball, conference play, all that good stuff. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline too. They're the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's put a bow on the McDaniels conversation. A couple more quick thoughts. So, Chris Finch, actually, Marnie Gellner and I talked about this on the live postcast after Monday's win over Denver. So you can go back and listen to that on the audio feeds or on YouTube over on Locked On Sports Minnesota. But Marty and I talked a bit about McDaniels and about how the way the Wolves were playing offensively, which was just basically moving the ball. Like, it's not complicated. Just move the ball, make Denver react. And what it ultimately led to was Denver played a lot of zone, especially in the first half, because they couldn't contain the ball at the point of attack when the Wolves had the ball in offense. And Marnie made the point that, like, when the ball moves, Jaden McDaniels is going to play better, right? Because otherwise he's not initiating. He's not going to get the ball. He's not going to get these isolation possessions like Ant and even D'Lo. Same thing with Rudy, right? Like, Rudy's not going to get these plays called for him. He's not dictating terms, right? The terms dictate how the type of games that McDaniels can have. And that's just the sort of player he is. But the key is when he gets those opportunities, can he capitalize? Because he's not I don't think we can necessarily pigeonhole him as like, oh, he's a souped up 3-and-D player. Like, he's only going to do these 3 things and that's his role. I think he could do basically everything, but because the Wolves have so many other guys initiating and dominating the ball, McDaniels has to make the most of his opportunities. And what did he shoot? Like 9 of 10 against Denver the other day. When he gets these opportunities playing off of Ant and D'Lo and when Towns is healthy, he could be so effective. And Chris Finch talked about this. The same thing Marnie and I talked about on the postcast. Finch said in his postgame comments, he said, was talking about how skilled McDaniels was, said, this is direct quote, can cut, crash, make a spot 3, play off the catch. But if the ball doesn't move, these things don't come to life for him. And then he referenced McDaniels, basically his production being a barometer for their offensive ball movement, right? So exactly what Marnie and I said. If McDaniels, you look at the box score at the end of the game, if McDaniels had an efficient game, if he was good offensively, it's a pretty good indicator that the Timberwolves moved the ball offensively and therefore probably had a pretty good offensive game, right? I mean, you look at the last 10, the last 2 games were probably the worst, the Bucks game and the Pistons game. The Heat loss, I would say, was the worst overall besides the Pistons. But the Wolves had some bad moments in the Bucks game, and Jaden was in some foul trouble. He did not. He finished with 4 points on 5 shots against Detroit. One of the worst, probably the worst game of the year. 8 points on 11 shots for Jaden McDaniels in that game. So I think that's a pretty good, to Finch's point, it's pretty obvious that McDaniels, when the offense is moving the ball, McDaniels will thrive. I think that that's pretty clear. Segueing into talking about Anthony Edwards, I thought this was just an interesting side note. Since we're talking about these two players, of the top, the Timberwolves have 9 two-man pairings that have played 500 or more minutes together. And I'll admit that's pretty arbitrary. I mean, they've got 4 pairings that are between 400 and 500, like another 10 or so that are between 300 and 400. But I'm going to keep it to the 9 that have played 500 or more minutes together. The only positive net rating for the top 9 Timberwolves two-man lineup pairings in terms of minutes is Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels. They're a plus 3.5. The other 8 out of the top 9 in terms of minutes are all negative. Edwards and McDaniels are also the second most in minutes, by the way, behind D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards. So Ant and Jaden together are second in minutes and first in net rating among those 9 lineups. You have to go down to the Noel and Edwards pairing, which is the 11th most used two-man pairing this season. They're a plus 7.1, which is easily the best among the top 20 or so lineups. You'd have to go all the way down further to Noel and McDaniels, who've only played 289 minutes together. They're a plus 9.3. So McDaniels is a pretty common denominator here when it comes to these positive net ratings. Like the Kyle Anderson lineup is also positive. The McDaniels-Towns lineup is also positive. McDaniels-Gobert is slightly negative. McDaniels-Russell, slightly negative. McDaniels-Edwards, again, a plus 3.5. So McDaniels is a common thread there. Ant has some good two-man pairings too. The net rating system likes what Anthony Edwards has done this season, more so than some of the advanced metrics. But all that to say, let's talk about Ant. So for the season, I've talked at length of the show. The shooting's got to be a little bit better. The decision-making, all those things for Ant have to be better than they have been to this point. However, over the last 10 games, it was after that second Portland game. Ant went 6 of 16 against Portland, and we'll talk about the Blazers here in a minute. Had 17 points on 16 shots. The Wolves lost to Portland by 21 points on the road on December 12th, so roughly 3 weeks ago, almost exactly 3 weeks ago. In the 10 games since then, after I did that whole, I'm worried about Ant on the podcast, 11 games since then. 11 games since then. He's averaged 27 points per game on 48.4% from the field, 37% from 3, so back up to where you'd like it to be, a little better than last year. He's up over 72% at the free throw line with a couple really rough performances in there. Just a hair under 8 rebounds per game. He's had, again, just in the last 11 games, he's had 4 games with 10 or more rebounds. And every game but one, he's had 6 or more rebounds in the last 11 games, which is a startling kind of flip from where we've seen him for his career. I'll mention his rebound rates numbers for his career here in a minute. But he's over 5 assists per game, just a hair under 8 rebounds per game, 1.5 steals per game, 1 block per game. So the percentages are great. He's been efficient. The volume scoring is over 27 points per game. And all those ancillary, those box score peripheral numbers are all really good too. And I've talked a ton on this show about his rebounding issues. He's finally got his total rebound rate up over 9%. His defensive rebound rate is over 16%. That's up almost 4 points from where it was last season. And last season, it was really bad. He was down rebounding the ball from where he was even as a rookie, because we saw some of that, I don't want to say laziness, but they're just so worried about scoring last year. He wasn't, and jumping passing lanes and exerting energy doing that, in this high wall blitzing coverage the Wolves played last season, trying to be that guy who was picking off passes and getting essentially pick sixes, to borrow a football term, right? This year, Ant is focused, at least over the last dozen plus games, on rebounding the ball a bit more. So the rebound rate's up almost 2 points. The defensive rebound rate is up almost 4 points for him. And across the board, we're seeing those rate-based stats really improve, and he's getting his numbers to a point where they're comparative. We can legitimately compare them to where they were last year. The three-point shooting's up a bit. Some of the defensive things are not consistent enough, but the passing, the rebounding, all those things are improving. And this time of the year, with Towns out, other guys in and out of the lineup, it's so important that this duo, Ant and Jaden McDaniels, improve. And they have done exactly that. Even though there's a 6-game losing streak baked in, the last 10, they're 4-6. Without Karl-Anthony Towns, Gobert missing a game, D'Lo missing a game, no Taurean Prince, no Jordan McLaughlin over the last 10. No Taurean Prince, no Jordan McLaughlin. You've had guys in and out of the lineup pretty consistently. And yet these two guys have played well. And they are, for all intents and purposes, the core of the team moving forward. Yeah, obviously Rudy Gobert is going to be around. But like Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards, I'm very curious to see what happens contract-wise for McDaniels, of course. That's a conversation for another day. But those guys could be around for a long time. The Wolves could trade Karl-Anthony Towns if they wanted to. D'Angelo Russell's a free agent. He's either going to get traded, leaving free agency, or he's not going to get paid very much to stay in Minnesota, right? So it's very important that McDaniels and Ant show what they've shown here of late. And they seem to be, I guess, peaking, showing that improvement at the right time for Minnesota. All right, let's close the show here by talking Wolves Blazers. All right, the Timberwolves took on the Portland Trailblazers about 3 weeks ago, twice in a row in Portland, 2 games in 3 days. Stayed in Portland for those 3 days. It was the old, stay in the same city. I don't know. I don't like that. I think it's weird. I get it. It's some people like it because it's like a mini playoff series. I don't like it because most of the time it's going to end in a split, right? It's very hard to beat a team twice in 3 days. And in the case of the Wolves in Portland, it was even worse because they did get beat twice. We saw one against Dallas just a week ago or so, and the Wolves did split those against Dallas, I guess 2 weeks ago now. But anyway, against Portland, the Wolves came into Portland a game over 500. They just beaten Utah on the road. Everyone was feeling pretty good about where things were, even with no Karl-Anthony Towns. And then they get a double-digit lead. The Wolves are up, I think, 10 in the second half. They end up losing to the Blazers by 6. They were down 2 going to the fourth quarter, ended up losing by 6 to Portland. And I thought the Wolves did an okay job on Dame in the first game. He had 36 points, but it took him 22 shots and 3 of 11 on threes. He committed 5 turnovers. The problem was he got to the line 15 times and made all 15 of his free throws. That was the biggest issue. If I remember right, I think I had some gripes with the officiating in this game. And the Wolves did a pretty good job on everybody else, except for Anthony Simons got hot at one point. But for the most part, it was just really Dame getting to the line, and the Wolves could not contain him. D'Angelo Russell had a rough defensive game. Offensively, though, like Gobert had 24 and 9 and 4 steals in this game. It was one of the, he hasn't had a ton of games like this since then. Ant was pretty good. The Wolves got what they wanted against Portland. And I didn't really have a problem with how they played in that first game. The second game against Portland, though, was pretty miserable. The Wolves went from giving up 15 free throws to Lillard in that first game to just 1 free throw attempt for Dame in game 2. But he had 17 three-point attempts and made 11 of them. Now, at one point, it was nuts. Like the Wolves had a hand in his face, and he just couldn't miss. That game was absolutely bonkers. But even still, like that doesn't give the Wolves, that's not an excuse for some of the other issues the Wolves had, right? Like they gave up 11 offensive rebounds to Portland. They let Nurkic get 14 and 16 against them. And I mean, Gobert played in this game. Gobert had 16 and 20 himself, but Nurkic had 14 and 16. And the Blazers shot almost 46% overall from 3-point range. So some of those same issues for Minnesota that we've seen defending the 3-point line, second chance points came up. And, Lillard gets hot on top of that, and that's a recipe for a 21-point loss. And that's exactly what happened. Since then, Portland's kind of treaded water. They did get Gary Payton the second back. He played his first game of the season the other night, played only 13 minutes, so he'll probably have a bit role in this game against the Wolves. Injury-wise, Portland still doesn't have Nasir Little. They still don't have Justice Winslow. They're both out with injuries. Those are both kind of, important rotation players for them. But Minnesota, by the way, I should mention, Naz Reid is still questionable with the back spasms that kept him out of the win against Denver on Monday. But Taurean Prince is questionable now for the first time. He's missed like 20 games with the shoulder subluxation, and he's questionable to play Wednesday. D'Lo is not on the injury report. He missed Monday's game due to illness, so expect Russell to play on Wednesday, barring anything unforeseen. And again, Portland is a team the Wolves should be able to play fast against. They're still just 18th in defensive rating. They're not a good defensive team overall, and they prefer to play a little bit slower. Now, everybody's running against the Wolves, right? Like we obviously saw Detroit do it on Saturday. We've seen, Milwaukee, teams that generally would be like, we're fine to slow down the pace. Coaches see they're playing the Wolves and they say, all right, let's run after makes. Let's run every opportunity we get because these guys don't get back. They, fall on the floor and they complain to the officials and they, are too worried about everything else besides getting back on defense. So don't be shocked if Portland does push the pace against Minnesota. I mean, those 2 games in Portland were both very high scoring. Portland scored 133 in the second of those games, right? So expect Portland to be comfortable pushing the pace, but the Wolves should be able to have, get a win in terms of transition, right? The Wolves need to win fast break points against Portland. Portland's still a really good offensive team, even if they don't play fast. They don't need to. They're third in three-point percentage of the season. Jeremy Grant's been unbelievable. He's like 45% from three on pretty solid volume. I mean, he's shooting 6 threes per game. Anthony Simons shooting 10 threes per game at 38%. Lillard shooting 11 at almost 38%. So the third best team in the league in three-point percentage. They're also a good offensive rebounding team. They get to the line a lot. That's a recipe for a top 10 offense, and that's what the Wolves have to deal with. So they need Rudy to play well. I thought they did a good job on Jokic on Monday, and other than a couple like Bones Highland runs and when Jokic kind of went nuts passing the ball a little bit in the second half, the Wolves did a really good job defensively. Their game plan is obviously different against Portland than it was against Denver. But if they can at least make Lillard's life difficult, try and run these guys off the three-point line, try to make them put it on the floor where they're a little bit less comfortable, and maybe, I don't know, try some different things, try some different guys on Dame. D'Angelo Russell cannot guard Damian Lillard. That's just not, it's not going to work. So can the Wolves be creative enough to slow down Portland in the half court? That to me is the key in this game. I think the Wolves will score, especially if they play offensively like they did the last, against Denver. If they move the ball, if they're opportunistic, they shouldn't have any problem scoring against Portland. It wasn't a problem in Portland a couple weeks ago. The problem was Damian Lillard and guarding the three-point line. Can the Wolves do that in this game? And also the offensive rebounds. I mean, they're like 11th in offensive rebound rate. The Wolves are still bottom 5 in defensive rebound rate. Can Minnesota clean the glass well enough defensively to keep Portland from getting some cheap points that way? Certainly not an easy game for Minnesota, but more winnable than the Clippers game Friday, more winnable than Denver game Monday should have been. I guess Denver was back-to-back. Portland's not here. I should mention, I did say this earlier, Portland beat Detroit on Monday, so by 19 points. So a winnable game, it would be awesome to get a 2-game winning streak before a tough game Friday, and then a couple of winnable road games after that. I think it's Houston and Detroit next week. So a big game Wednesday for Minnesota. We'll, of course, do the live postcast immediately following with Marnie, about 45 minutes or so, I guess, following the end of the game. And then we'll do the post-game pod for Thursday's show bright and early on Thursday. So make sure to follow and subscribe to the show. A big thank you if you do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's an app you can find on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow at Locked On T-Wolves and also my account, which is at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on the biggest stories. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. Now make the Game to Game podcast, the Game to Game NBA podcast, your second listen today. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.